The beginnings were as inadvertent as they come. Hastily drawn up and jammed into the entirely unrelated Safe Port Act, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act passed through Congress in September of 2006, then, with President Bush's signature a month later, became law. The unremarkable bit of legislation banned gambling companies from taking payments over the internet made in violation of state or federal law. For the old guard of online gambling, the likes of Full Tilt Poker, PokerStars, and Absolute Poker, the new law would prove an existential threat. For a set of upstarts, though, it functioned as the legal foundation of an as-yet untapped market. In trying to close one loophole, the act opened another with this seemingly innocuous exemption: that betting and wagering did not include participation in fantasy sports, which were deemed as games of skill, not chance. At the time, the distinction made sense. Fantasy sports were fundamentally different from any sort of online gambling. People didn't get rich off fantasy sports, nor did they lose thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of dollars in one fell swoop. Fantasy team owners wagered on season-long outcomes with their friends from school or work and poured over stat sheets for bragging rights as much as money. They might have been obsessed, but they were never quite addicted. Then, in 2009, a fateful backyard brainstorm at South by Southwest completely altered the trajectory of fantasy sports and, as it would turn out, sports betting. The company that coalesced under the Austin sun was called FanDuel, and it was everything that fantasy wasn't. Countering the traditional season-long league, FanDuel offered daily fantasy. Rather than just playing with your buddies, the service provided tournaments and cash games to compete against countless others. Whereas traditional fantasy leagues only saw minimal financial exchanges in league buy-ins and annual draft guides, FanDuel moved major money. Just one good day, they advertised, could net a couple $1,000s. And, thanks to the Unlawful Gambling Enforcement Act of 2006, it was online and in your pocket. What had been slow-moving and cumbersome was now fast and convenient. Just play from your phone, win, and cash out that very same day. Young people followed, and so too did money. FanDuel's first rounds of funding topped $1 million, then $4 million, then, by 2013, $11 million. As investment climbed, so too did winnings. That same year, the platform crowned its first $1 million prize winner during its December Fantasy Football Championship and dished out more than $150 million in prize money overall. The following year, FanDuel partnered with the NBA, while its rising competitor, DraftKings, nabbed the MLB and NHL. Suddenly, companies that didn't exist just years prior were outspending the entire beer industry, running ads every 90 seconds on national TV. With palm-of-your-hand convenience, cheap buy-ins, mouth-watering prize potential, and unavoidable promotional offers, daily fantasy services had maximized the potential of fantasy sports. Sports fans played, sports leagues and media invested, while critics and academics began asking exactly to what extent this sped-up, further gamified version of fantasy sports actually differed from sports betting. Yet, rather than regulators intervening, legislators, league leaders, team owners, and daily fantasy consumers alike began to rethink just how bad sports betting really was. Banned by Congress in every state except Nevada and opposed by all major leagues, sports betting had long been perceived as the antithesis of fair sport. This wasn't only the position held by league commissioners either, as 56% of Americans polled in 1993 disapproved of its legalization. Through the 2000s, after point-shaving scandals rocked college basketball, then insider betting in the NBA came to light, betting remained a dark, shady sports underworld in the view of most, and, to league leaders, a direct threat. Even through 2012, NFL's Roger Goodell, MLB's Bud Selig, NHL's Gary Bettman, and NCAA's Mark Emmert each came out against the idea of overturning the federal ban. Or at least, that's what they said outwardly. As teams and leagues entered partnerships with gambling-adjacent fantasy platforms, internal conversations slowly shifted from sports betting as a scourge to sports betting as a potential opportunity. Daily fantasy drove more fan engagement, and so too would sports betting. At the same time, sports fans were voting with their wallets, as the American Gaming Association estimated that Americans were spending about $150 billion on wagers annually, with only a small fraction actually going through legal means in Nevada. Then finally, the head of the NBA came out and said it. If Americans were spending billions on sports bets, American newspapers and media were publishing betting lines, and other countries were finding success in regulating nationwide gambling, then why not just legalize it? By and large, the public followed the logic, as 2017 polling showed that 55% of Americans had now come to favor the idea of legalized regulated gambling, while only 33% opposed it. Polling, though, doesn't overturn federal bans. But the timing was perfect. While daily fantasy shot skyward and American opinion came around, the legality of the federal ban was coming under question. New Jersey's effort to legalize sports betting to prop up a faltering Atlantic City had climbed all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 2018, a surprise ruling opened the floodgates as Justice Alito delivered the 7-2 opinion acknowledging that while sports gambling is fraught with controversy, it ultimately wasn't the federal government's constitutional right to ban it. Rather, that it was the choice of each individual state. The race was on. 8 states legalized sports betting in 2018. 10 more joined in 2019. Sportsbooks opened in state and tribal casinos, sports venues added betting kiosks, while DraftKings and FanDuel, the darlings of daily fantasy, opened up brick-and-mortar lounges across the US and launched mobile online betting in states that allowed it. But this race to legalize wasn't between states. This was a time trial to see which gambling industry representatives could secure legalization as quickly as possible in the friendliest terms possible. For the likes of FanDuel and DraftKings, who had previously spent millions ensuring that state legislators saw daily fantasy as a game of skill and not of luck, the strategy was already established and the team already assembled. From Trenton to Tallahassee to Topeka, lobbyists bought lawmakers gifts and presented the plot points of a new path over expensive glasses of wine. Legalized sports betting, they pitched, would bring tax revenue by the millions. And besides, they argued, people were betting illegally anyway. Why not bring it above board, bring in revenue, and create a win-win? Or what about a win-win-win, they'd ask, where regulations and taxes are slightly less burdensome, so more sportsbooks are incentivized to enter the market, so more users have more outlets to bet, so more volume brings the state more tax revenue. The pressure was immense, as the deep pockets of the world's most recognizable casinos spared no expense in helping state legislators see the issue from their point of view. While the extent varied from state to state, the blitz was largely a success. By 2022, 30 US states and Washington, D.C. had some form of legal and active sports betting. And this wasn't the sports betting of old. This was sports betting in the digital age. Sure, like before, people bet on the individual outcome of the game they were going to heighten the experience. They put future bets down on whether or not the teams would match the win totals that their sportsbook projected, and wagered on odds for end-of-season awards and champions. But now they bet on far more, too. Odds not for games, but for halves and quarters. Propositional bets that didn't have to do with the outcome of the game, like player points or shots on goals, and in-game parlays that combine propositional bets with score outcomes to boost potential payouts. Just as mobile devices turned fantasy games from 4-month seasons to daily games, mobile gaming apps unlocked in-game betting that people could wager on in the middle of the sporting event they were watching on TV. People had more options and easier access than ever before, and the established gaming houses of Vegas took note. Joining FanDuel and DraftKings were online sportsbooks by familiar names like BetMGM, Caesars, WynnBET, and Penn National Gaming's Barstool Sportsbook, while various other casinos and companies launched smaller, more regional online outfits. In 2019, US betting revenue doubled that of 2018. Then 2020, despite sports as an entity disappearing globally for a matter of months, saw revenue nearly double once again. Then in 2021, revenue tripled to over $4.3 billion a year. Simply put, sports betting just exploded. Or at least, it looked like it exploded. It looked like an unmitigated force of nature, perhaps triggered by humans, but hardly managed by them. But that's what the industry wanted it to look like. To support the plot that they had laid out to legislators prior to legalization, they wanted it to look like this was only natural, that there was always a huge volume of betting behind closed doors, and that sector growth merely represented this phenomena moving into the legal space where it could be taxed and regulated. While that was undoubtedly part of it, a huge additional chunk of this growth was precipitated by a carefully choreographed, long-planned deluge of spending and effort by the burgeoning industry, a well-funded scramble for market share before a hierarchy could set in. They knew that if the industry looked anything less than unstoppable, it could be stopped. Step 1 was to normalize the practice, and for this, the industry was gifted a massive opportunity: the COVID-19 pandemic. With the world of sports reopening into a new, less physical, less social context, the industry realized it could capitalize on the degraded fan experience to effectively manufacture a new normal. Spend was slowly and steadily growing pre-pandemic, but come Q3 2020, as the NHL, NBA, and MLB restarted their seasons in various forms of biosecure bubbles, the industry spent 3 times more than any prior quarter on TV advertising. And logos went everywhere. FanDuel adorned the boards around the NHL's pandemic-proof rink in Edmonton, on screens sitting where the NBA's courtside seats would normally go, on the pitcher's mound at MLB ballparks, and anywhere else where a competitor hadn't already inked a deal. With the knowledge that their most promising customer demographic was 18 to 35-year-old men, based on their above-average propensity to develop long-term, potentially addictive gambling habits, companies even inked deals with LSU, Michigan State University, CU Boulder, and other colleges to advertise sports betting to their own students. Sometimes, as a New York Times investigation exposed, to the extent of paying a fixed amount per sign-up. This sports betting omnipresence wasn't normal, but it was tough for anyone to recognize that when nothing was. But making the practice feel as integral to the sports viewing experience as donning a jersey or assembling some nachos was only half the battle. Once the gambling companies got people in, they had to keep them. They had to turn a sign-up into a habit, and for that, there were inducements. The concept is loosely based on the casino experience. In Vegas, around 40% of gambling is conducted by the top 5% of gamblers, the high rollers, so the casinos generally focus their inherently limited resources on keeping these gamblers gambling. Typically, that task falls on to the casino hosts. They're supposed to act as the high rollers' friend, accompanying them to dinners, arranging show tickets, grabbing drinks from the bar, booking free flights, really doing anything they can to make the guests' experience better. But what their job really is to use that social dynamic and the power to occasionally reimburse some losses to subtly nudge the high roller towards playing more and betting bigger. The opportunity with online sports betting was that this task could be automated and extended to all, no matter if they bet $1 or $1 million. For example, if an algorithm predicts that a player is likely to stop betting after a string of losses, which some can with remarkable accuracy, it'll automatically offer a risk-free bet. If they lose the next one, they'll get their money back. But the terms will indicate the money returned can't be withdrawn. It has to be spent on another bet. After 2 additional bets, there's every chance the player wins one and decides to keep going, but even if they don't, they've gotten back into the groove of it, so even given the high cost of this inducement, the economics work out in aggregate so that free bets are a winning proposition for the gambling companies. The systems are just incredibly effective at forming a habit in their players in a cost-effective manner. Unsurprisingly, myriad academic research has demonstrated that inducements have a dramatic effect on the size of bets and encourages the behavior that turns gambling from a form of entertainment into a problem. Governments know this, and yet they allow this. In fact, not only are inducements legal, but in many states, thanks to aggressive lobbying, they are tax exempt, meaning sports betting companies have avoided paying millions upon millions of dollars in taxes by engaging in the practice that develops addicts. Underfunded and overstretched, state regulatory agencies have been unable to properly manage the sports betting companies, and their corresponding legislators have overwhelmingly failed to resist the influence of some of America's highest paid and most effective lobbyists. While everyone in the equation hides it as best as possible, the gambling industry is in charge. They're calling the shots, and America is slowly and quietly turning into a nation of gamblers. This is far from unprecedented. On the other side of the equator, one of the US's closest cultural equivalents has already marched far further down this path. Australia is already a nation of gamblers. It is as deeply intertwined into society as guns are to America's. No population loses more to gambling than Australia's. Each adult resident averages over $1,000 a year in loss, a clean doubling of America's equivalent figure. And the explanation is concerningly straightforward. In the US, casinos are a destination. From the center of New York City, the closest proper one is a 50-minute trek into Queens. From Dallas, it's an 80-minute drive north to Chickasaw Land in Oklahoma. From San Francisco, it's a similar 60-minute drive north into Sonoma County. In Australia, however, casinos are city center attractions. Melbourne's Crown Casino development sits just across from the city's central business district and has turned the riverfront into a lively nightlife destination that just happens to include a place to play poker, roulette, or craps. Sydney's newest, tallest skyscraper now sits just steps away from the very location where the first fleet of European settlers started their colony and acts as the home to another Crown Casino development. And up in Brisbane, a slice of its city center was torn down and is now being rebuilt into the largest casino development in the country, which will tower over and look down upon the historic neighborhood below. Even Las Vegas separates the bulk of its casinos away from the city center. In Australia, they're tough to avoid. Gambling doesn't have to be purposefully planned. It can simply be spontaneous, a convenient, accessible way to turn one's day around for the better, or more often, worse. But the concerning convenience compounds. Across the country, nestled in a sizable proportion of bars and clubs, sit 188,000 slot machines, or pokies, as the locals would call them. That's one for every 137 residents. They are simply everywhere, but they're especially in the areas that use them the most, which more often than not are low-income neighborhoods. In Sydney, for example, adult residents of the upscale ritzy Coringa area only lost an average of $180 a year to the pokies. Meanwhile, to the west, in Fairfield, overwhelmingly home to low-income immigrant families, the average adult lost nearly 10 times as much, $1,558 a year. And this pattern extends city and country-wide. The lower the average income, the higher the average annual gambling loss. From a systematic perspective, gambling in Australia is acting as a wealth transfer mechanism from lower-income individuals to wealthy gambling conglomerate owners, and this has crafted a legitimate nationwide public health crisis. Roughly 1 of every 14 Australians have exhibited signs of problematic gambling behavior. The government says this, the government knows this, and yet the government enables this because the gambling companies are in control. The methods used to exert their influence are neither unique nor interesting. It's the same lobbying, political donations, and revolving door between industry and politics that you see in America and beyond. It's just its extent and effectiveness that sets Australia apart. As many observers have put it, the gambling industry is Australia's equivalent of the American gun lobby. But there is still one final step in the gambling industry's grand plan. People gamble more when it's convenient. We know that people play more when they live closer to pokie machines. We know that people sports bet more when they can do so on their phones. And so the gambling industry knows what their biggest legislative win to date would be: iGaming. That's the technical term for the broad bucket of chance-based gambling, roulette, slots, bingo, and more, taking place on the internet or apps. This would create a problem. Time and time again, a causal relationship has been demonstrated between accessibility of gambling and the likelihood of it developing into a problem, so the legalization of iGaming would undoubtedly increase the number of addicts. Gambling can be safe and fun, just like alcohol can be safe and fun. Consumed in the right amounts, in the right places, by the right people, there is no problem with drinking. Done in the right amounts, in the right places, by the right people, there doesn't have to be a problem with gambling. But in both cases, improper use can wreak havoc on life and livelihood. And increasingly in America, legal gambling is occurring improperly. Gambling has to be a destination, not a convenience. Anyone can have a terrible, hopeless day, log onto an app, wager far more than is responsible, lose it in an instant, and trigger a downward spiral of issues that turns a bad day into a bad year. Far fewer people can have a bad day, drive 80 minutes north to Oklahoma, and still think it's a good idea to wager an excessive amount. Putting such potential pain in people's pockets requires a degree of personal responsibility that few players are able to consistently fulfill across the full spectrum of emotions. Right now, on average, across the US, the power balance swings towards gambling companies rather than the regulators. Underfunded and overworked state regulators are struggling to cope with the massive, well-funded explosion in online gambling, and so regulation of existing rules is inconsistent and weak. Gambling companies feel this, and it means they consistently operate off of forgiveness rather than permission. Gambling companies need to be terrified of regulators to keep the industry safe. Notably, Nevada's Gaming Commission has a death grip on Las Vegas casinos, holding them to an exceptionally high standard, leading to gambling companies often operating above those standards to allow for a margin of error. But in the rest of the US, those very same companies and more consistently skirt, bend, and push the rules because they know they can get away with it. They downplay the risk of loss in advertising, even when that's illegal. They allow gamblers to accumulate credit card debt through deposits, even when that's illegal. They operate sports betting on lower division semi-professional leagues, even when that's illegal, and more often than not, they're just told to do better in the future. Sports betting doesn't have to be a problem. It can be what it's portrayed as. It can be a fun, social way of upping the emotional stakes of the viewing experience. But far too often, it fails to hit the mark. Faced with few roadblocks and increasingly capable in knocking the remaining ones down, the industry is doing what industry does: finding and following the greatest possible revenue opportunity by turning the US into a nation of addicts. The trend is worrying, and it is a trend. West Virginia, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Michigan all have legalized some form of iGaming, and more states are expected to follow in 2023. The dominoes are falling, the slow, silent march continues, and the gambling industry takes another step forward in its grand plan to consume America and Americans alike. Okay, so I'm really weirdly excited for this ad read because it's been an incredibly long time coming. 6 months ago, I made a video called The Carbon Offset Problem, where the conclusion was that while carbon offsets as a concept can theoretically work, the current marketplace for them enables and even incentivizes scams to the point where they're nothing more than a greenwashing tool on average. The video got a ton of attention and was even included in a John Oliver segment about the same subject, and then a little later, the people at a company called Wren reached out and claimed they had created a system to help make offsets actually work. I talked with their CEO Landon, their project evaluator Sophie, and a few others over there for over an hour, and they walked me through the process and responded really well to all my grilling, and I left pretty confident that Wren is as good as it gets in the carbon offsetting market. As you might remember from my video, offsetting is only as good as the accuracy of project evaluation, so their project evaluator Sophie showed me the hundreds of tiny details that she individually verifies to make sure a project is actually going to do what it says it will, and it's an ongoing process once the project actually starts too. They only have 7 active projects, so they put a ton of focus into each, but one thing I think is really smart is they only sell offsets in a combined portfolio of all of these. That way, they reduce risk and build in a margin for error if one project falls short. In addition, unlike single project offsets, they can use the fund to help finance more experimental or ancillary projects that still help fight the climate crisis but are tougher to quantify in tons of carbon. For example, they recently added Carbon 180 to the mix, where they're helping this policy group that advocates and works for more funding for offset projects, which hopefully leads to a compounding effect. I could go on and on about all the different tiny ways they assure what they're doing actually works, but the thing to know is that, based on what I know about the subject, Wren is the real deal, and if you're still skeptical, you should check out their website because they do a good job of explaining how. So if you want to be genuinely as sure as possible that you actually offset emissions from taking a flight, for example, they're the place to go. I've turned down plenty of carbon offsetting sponsors in the past, and have opened myself up to plenty of criticism by doing this since I've been such a vocal critic of the carbon offsetting market, so you can know that I genuinely believe in them. They'll be what I use going forward, both for my personal and business carbon offsetting, and I think you should too. They make it super simple to calculate your personal carbon footprint and give personalized suggestions on how to reduce it. Then for anything else, you can set up a monthly offset so you can reduce your personal contribution to the climate crisis. Doing this probably costs a lot less than you think, and it's even less considering that if you click the button on screen or head to our link in the description, they'll pay to offset the first month of emissions for the first 100 people to sign up.